Good evening, everyone. We are ready for the next chapter of The Temple and the Lodge. Once I get my captions fixed. Hello. Hello. Okay. Oh, there we go. There they are. And I'm going to switch screens because I'm going to end up doing this later when I play the next session of Hogwarts Legacy. So we'll go ahead and get it fixed too. And now we're ready for Chapter 4 of the Temple and Lodge. So I'm going to settle back in here. I just got out of a Zoom meeting. My bi-weekly Zoom meeting. All right. Arrests and torture. Oh, wait. Oh, yeah, Part 4, but this is Chapter 3. All right. By 1306, the temple had become a focus of particular attention for King Philip IV of France, known as Philip le Bel. Philip was enormously ambitious. He had grandiose designs for his country and little compunction about crushing whomever or whatever stood in his way. He had already engineered the kidnapping and murder of one pope, Boniface VIII, and is widely believed to have orchestrated the death, probably by poison, of another, Benedict IX, who followed. By 1305, he had installed his own puppet on the papal throne, Bertrand de Goth, formerly Archbishop of Bordeaux, who became Pope Clement V. In 1309, Philippe hijacked the papacy itself, uprooting it from Rome and relocating it on French soil at Avignon, where it became, in effect, a mere appendage of the French crown. This inaugurated the so-called Avignon Captivity, a schism which was to produce rival popes and divide the Catholic Church for the next 68 years until 1377. With the papacy thus in his pocket, Philippe had the latitude he needed to move against the temple. He had a number of motives for doing so, and a personal grudge against the knights as well. He had asked to be received into the order as an honorary Templar, the kind of status previously conferred to Richard I, and had been insultingly refused. Then in June 1306, a rioting mob had forced him to seek refuge in the Paris temple, where he witnessed at first hand the staggering extent of the order's wealth and resources. Philippe desperately needed money, and the Templar treasure must have made him salivate. In the king's attitude toward the knights, greed was thus dangerously compounded with humiliation and vindictiveness. Finally, the Templars posed, or would have seemed to Philippe's eyes, to have posed a very real threat to the stability of his kingdom. In 1291, as we have seen, Acre, the last bastion of the Western Crusades in the Holy Land, had fallen to the Saracens, and the Latin kingdom of Jerusalem had been irretrievably lost. This had left the Templars the best trained, best equipped, most professional military force in the Western world without a raison d'etre, and for ominously and more ominously for Philippe, without a home. They had already established a provisional base on Cyprus, but harbored more ambitious designs. Not surprisingly, they dreamed of a state or principality of their own, similar to the Ordensstaat created by their kindred order, the Teutonic Knights, in Prussia and on the Baltic. But the Ordensstaat was on the extreme fringe of Christian Europe, far beyond the reach of the papacy and the power of any secular potentate. Moreover, the Ordensstaat could be rationalized and justified as another form of crusade, a crusade against the heathen tribes of northeastern Europe, against the pagan Prussians and Balts, the Lithuanians, against the Orthodox and therefore heretical city-states of northwestern Russia, such as Pskov and Novgorod. The Templars, on the other hand, who already wielded immense influence in France, contemplated creating their own Ordensstaat in the very heart of European Christendom, in the Languedoc, which during the previous century had effectively been annexed by the French crown. For Philippe, the prospect of a Templar principality on his southern doorstep, a principality encompassing territory to which he laid claim, could only foster resentment and alarm. Philippe planned Philippe planned his stratagem meticulously. A catalogue of charges was compiled, partly from the king's spies who had infiltrated the order, partly from the voluntary confession of an alleged renegade knight. Armed with these accusations, Philippe was free to act, and when he administered his blow it was sudden, swift, and lethal. In an operation worthy of a modern secret police raid, the king issued sealed orders to his seneschals and bailiffs throughout the country. These orders were to be opened everywhere simultaneously and implemented at once. At dawn on Friday the 13th, October 1307, all Templars in France were to be seized and placed under arrest by the king's men, their preceptories placed under royal sequestration, their goods confiscated. But although Philippe's objective of surprise seemed to have been attained, the most alluring prize of all, the order's legendary wealth, eluded him. It was never found, and what became of the fabulous treasure of the Templars has remained a mystery. In fact, it is questionable whether Philippe's surprise coup was as unexpected as he or subsequent historians believed. There is considerable evidence to suggest the Templars received some kind of advance warning shortly before the swoop. For example, the Grand Master Jacques de Molay called in many of the order's books and extant rules and had them burnt. A knight who withdrew from the temple around this time was told by the treasurer that he was extremely wise, as some sort of crisis was imminent. An official edict was circulated to all French preceptories, stressing that no information about the order's rites or rituals was to be released. In any case, whether the Templars were warned in advance or whether they simply sensed what was in the wind, certain precautions were definitely taken. In the first place, many knights fled, and those who were captured seem to have submitted passively, as if under instructions to do so. At no point is there any record of French Templars actively resisting the king's seneschals. In the second place, there are indications of an organized flight by a particular group of knights, virtually all of whom were in some way associated with the order's treasurer. Given these manifestations of preparedness, it is not surprising that the treasure of the temple, together with almost all of its documents and records, should have disappeared. Under interrogation by the Inquisition, one knight spoke of the treasure being smuggled from the Paris preceptory shortly before the arrests. The same witness declared that the preceptor of France who left the capital with 50 horses and put to sea. There is no indication from where, with 18 galleys, none of which was ever seen again. Whether this was true or not, the whole of the Templar fleet does seem to have escaped the king's clutches. There is no report of any of the order's ships being taken, not only then, but ever. On the contrary, the ships appear to have vanished utterly, along with whatever they might have been carrying. In France, the arrested Templars were tried and many were subjected to hideous torture. Accusations grew even wilder, and strange confessions were extracted. Grim rumors began to circulate about the country. The Templars, it is said, worshipped a demonic power called Baphomet. At their secret ceremonies, they supposedly prostrated themselves before a bearded male head which spoke to them and invested them with magical virtues. Unauthorized witnesses of these ceremonies were reported to have disappeared, and there were other charges as well, even more vague. The Templars were accused of infanticide, of teaching women how to abort, of obscene kisses at the induction of postulants of homosexuality. But one charge leveled against them stands out as most bizarre and seemingly improbable. These soldiers of Christ, who had fought and laid down their lives for Christendom by the hundreds, were accused of ritually denying Christ, of repudiating, trampling, and spitting on the cross. This is not the place to explore the validity or otherwise of these charges. We ourselves have considered them in detail elsewhere. So have numerous other commentators. Indeed, entire books have been written on the trials of the Templars and the question of the order's guilt or innocence. In the present context, it is sufficient simply to acknowledge that the Templars were almost certainly tainted with religious heterodoxy, if not full-fledged heresy. Most of the other accusations against them, however, were in all likelihood trumped up, fabricated, or exaggerated out of all proportion. Of all the knights interrogated and subjected to torture, for example, only 2, according to the Inquisition records, ever confessed to homosexuality. If homosexuality did exist within the order, it is unlikely to have done so on a scale greater than in any other closed male community, military or monastic. The trials commenced within 6 days of the initial arrest. At first, the prosecution of the temple was undertaken by the king's legal officers, but Philippe also had a pope in his pocket and quickly bullied his puppet into supporting him with all the august weight of the papal authority. The persecution inaugurated by the French crown rapidly spread far beyond France and was taken over by the Inquisition. It was to continue for 7 years. What seems to us today a minor, generally obscure fragment of medieval history was to become the single most dominant issue of its time, dramatically eclipsing events in faraway Scotland, galvanizing opinions and reactions across the Christian world, sending tremors throughout Western culture. The temple, it must be remembered, was, with the sole exception of the papacy, the most important, most powerful, most prestigious, most apparently unshakable institution of its age. At the time of Philippe's attack, it was nearly 2 centuries old and was regarded as one of the central pillars of Western Christendom. For most of its contemporaries, it seemed as immutable, as durable, as permanent as the Church herself. That such an edifice should be so summarily demolished rocked the foundation upon which rested the assumptions and beliefs of an epoch. Thus, for example, Dante in the Divine Comedy expresses his shock and his sympathy for the persecuted white mantles. Indeed, the superstition which holds Friday the 13th to be a day of misfortune is believed to stem from Philippe's initial raids on Friday the 13th, October 1307. The Order of the Temple was officially dissolved by papal decree on 22 March 1312, without a definitive verdict of guilt or innocence ever being pronounced. In France, however, the knights were to be harried for another 2 years. Finally, on March 1314, Jacques de Molay, the Grand Master, and Geoffroy de Charnay, the preceptor of Normandy, were roasted to death over a slow fire on the Ile de la Cité in the Seine. A plaque on the site commemorates the event. The Inquisition. The zeal with which Philippe harried the Templars is more than a little suspicious. One can understand his seeking to extirpate the order within his own domains, but to go so far as to seek out every Templar in Christendom is surely a little excessive. Did he fear the order's vengeance? He can hardly have been motivated by moral fervor, nor is it likely that the monarch who had contrived the death of at least one pope and probably a second would be fastidious about purity of faith, or for loyalty to the Church. The Church had effectively become his. He did not have to be loyal to it. He could define his own loyalty. In any case, Philippe badgered his fellow monarchs to join him in the persecution of the Temple. In this endeavor he met with only qualified success. In Lorraine, for example, which was part of Germany at the time, the Templars were supported by the reigning duke. A few were tried and quickly exonerated. Most appear to have obeyed their preceptor, who reputedly instructed them to shave their beards, don secular garb, and melt into the local populace, who, significantly enough, did not betray them. In Germany proper, the Templars openly defied their would-be judges, appearing in court fully armed and manifestly prepared to defend themselves. Intimidated, the judges promptly pronounced them innocent, and when the order was officially dissolved, many German Templars found a welcome in the Order of St. John or in the Teutonic Order. In Spain, too, the Templars resisted their persecutors and found a haven in other orders, especially Calatrava, and a new order was created, Montesa, primarily as a refuge for fugitive Templars. I thought he said he had... Well, anyway, in Portugal, the Templars were cleared by an inquiry and simply modified their name, becoming the Knights of Christ. They survived under this title well into the 16th century, their maritime explorations leaving an indelible mark on history. Vasco da Gama was a Knight of Christ. Prince Henry the Navigator was a Grand Master of the order. Ships of the Knights of Christ sailed under the Templars' familiar red pate cross. I don't. It looks like pate to me. And it was under the same cross that Columbus's 3 caravels crossed the Atlantic to the New World. Columbus himself was married to the daughter of a former Grand Master of the order and had access to his father-in-law's charts and diaries. That's something I didn't know. If Philippe found little support for harrying the Templars elsewhere on the continent, he had reason to expect greater cooperation from England. Edward II, after all, was his son-in-law, but Edward was initially reluctant. Indeed, the English monarch makes it clear in his letters that he not only found the charges against the Templars incredible, but also doubted the integrity of those making them. Thus, on 4 December 1307, less than a month and a half after the first arrests, he wrote to the kings of Portugal, Castile, Aragon, and Sicily. Quote, he, Philippe's envoy, dared to publish before us certain horrible and detestable enormities repugnant to the Catholic faith, to the prejudice of the aforesaid brothers, and endeavoring to persuade us that we ought to imprison all the brethren. End quote. And he concluded by requesting that the recipient, quote, turn a deaf ear to the slanders of ill-natured men who are animated, as we believe, not with the zeal of rectitude, but with the spirit of cupidity and envy. End quote. 10 days later, however, Edward received from the Pope an official bull sanctioning and provisionally justifying the arrests. This obliged him to act, but still he did so with marked reluctance and a signal lack of fervor. On 20 December, he wrote to all sheriffs in England, instructing them 3 weeks later to take 10 or 12 men they trusted and arrest all members of the temple in their domains. In the presence of at least one reliable witness, an inventory was to be made of all possessions found on Templar premises, and the Templars themselves were to be placed in custody, but not in hard and vile prison. English Templars were held at the Tower of London, as well as at the Castle of York, Lincoln, and Canterbury. The action against them proceeded in a decidedly dilatory fashion. Thus, for example, the English master William de la More was arrested on 9 January 1308 and lodged in Canterbury Castle, along with 2 other brethren, and sufficient possessions to ensure him considerable comfort, if not luxury. On 27 May he was released, and 2 months later granted the income from 6 Templar estates for his support. Only in November, as a result of renewed pressure, was he re-arrested and subjected to a harsher discipline. By then, however, most English Templars had had ample opportunity to escape by going to ground, and the civilian populace by finding a refuge in other orders or by fleeing the country. In September 1309 the papal inquisitors arrived in England, and such Templars as had been arrested were lodged for interrogation in London, York, or Lincoln. During the course of the next month, Edward, as if prompted by an afterthought, wrote to his representatives in Ireland and Scotland, ordering that all Templars not yet arrested were to be apprehended and placed in the castles at Dublin and Edinburgh. It is thus clear that a great many Templars were still at large, and with the king's knowledge. Between 20 October and 18 November 1309, some 47 Templars were interrogated in London on the basis of a list of 87 charges. No confessions were elicited apart from the acknowledgment that officers of the order, like priests, claimed the right to grand absolution from sin. Frustrated, the inquisitors decided to resort to torture. As traveling emissaries of the Pope, they had, of course, no machinery or manpower of their own with which to administer torture, and had to make formal application to the secular authorities. They did this in the second week of December. Edward granted them permission only for limited torture, and this, too, failed to elicit confessions. On 14 December 1309, more than 2 years after the first arrests in France and a year after the demand for more stringent measures in England, Edward again wrote to his sheriffs. He had heard, he said, that Templars were still wandering about in secular habit, committing apostasy. Once again, however, neither he nor his officers pursued the matter with any inordinate vigor. On 12 March 1310, he wrote to the Sheriff of York, quote, "As the king understands that he, the sheriff, permits the Templars to wander about in contempt of the king's order," end quote, "they are to be kept inside the castle." And yet on 4 January 1311, Edward once more wrote to the Sheriff of York, noting that despite all previous orders, Templars were still allowed to wander about. In the meantime, while the desultory fuss was developing over Templars already in captivity, nothing was done about the numerous knights in England who had escaped arrest. More zealous efforts on the part of the Inquisition led to the discovery and apprehension of only 9 such fugitives. The Pope complained to the Archbishop of Canterbury and to other prominent prelates elsewhere that a number of Templars had so completely integrated themselves with the civilian populace as to marry, which they could not have done without at least some cooperation from English authorities. By this time, torture was already being applied to members of the order in custody. In June 1310, however, the Inquisition produced a document detailing their lack of success. They protested that they had had difficulty in getting torture applied correctly and effectively. It did not, they complained, appear native to English justice, and even though the king had reluctantly consented to it, the jailers had offered only tepid cooperation. A number of suggestions were made to render the trials more effective. Among these was a recommendation that the arrested Templars be transferred to France, where they could be properly tortured by men with both the taste and the expertise for such pastimes. On 6 August 1310, the Pope wrote a letter of protest castigating the English king for his refusal to allow sensible torture. At last, Edward capitulated and instructed that Templars in the Tower be taken to the inquisitors for what was euphemistically called the application of ecclesiastical law. Even this, however, seems to have been less than successful, for twice in October the king had to repeat his decree. At last, in June 1311, the Inquisition in England made the breakthrough it had been seeking for so long. This breakthrough did not significantly enough result from further torture of Templars already in captivity, but from a fugitive Templar only recently apprehended in Salisbury. One Stephen de Stapelbruge. Stephen became the first Templar in England to confess the heretical practices within the order. During his induction, he reported he was shown a crucifix and instructed to deny that Jesus was God and man, and that Mary was his mother. He was then, he said, ordered to spit on the cross. Stephen also confessed to many of the other charges leveled against the Templars. The order's errors, he declared, had originated around the Agen region in France. This last assertion adds a measure of plausibility to Stephen's testimony. During the 12th and 13th centuries, Agen had been one of the hotbeds of the Albigensian or Cathar heresy, and Cathars had survived in this vicinity at least as late as 1250. There's overwhelming evidence that the Templars had been infected, to use the clerical term, with Cathar thought, and even provided a haven for Cathars fleeing the Inquisition. Indeed, one of the order's most important and influential Grand Masters, Bertrand de Blanchefort, came from a long-established Cathar family. Moreover, Agen lay in the Templar province of Provence. Between 1248 and 1250, the master of Provence was one Roncelin de Fosse. Then between 1251 and 1253, Roncelin was master of England. By 1260, he was again master of Provence and presided in that capacity until 1278. It is thus quite possible that Roncelin brought aspects of heretical Cathar thought from their native soil in France to England. This suggestion is supported by the testimony before the Inquisition of Geoffrey de Gonneville, preceptor of Aquitaine and Poitou. According to Geoffrey, unnamed individuals alleged that all evil and perverse rules and innovations in the temple had been introduced by a certain brother Roncelin, formerly a master of the order. The brother Roncelin in question is bound to have been Roncelin de Fosse. Perhaps a bit too conveniently, Stephen de Stapelbruge confessions Stephen de Stapelbruge's confession was quickly followed by two others which substantiated it, from Thomas Tochi de Thoraldeby and John de Stroke. According to Thomas, a former master of England, Brian de Jay, had said that Christ was not the true God, but a mere man. John de Stroke's testimony was particularly important, for he had previously been treasurer of the temple in London. As treasurer, he would have been the highest-ranking non-military officer of the order in England, and as the London Temple was also a royal depository, he would have been personally known to both Edward I and Edward II. He was to be the most importantly placed Templar in England to confess to anything. In his previous testimonies, John de Stroke, now it says Stoke, I don't know which is which, Stoke, had denied all accusations. Now, however, he declared that on a visit to Temple Garway in Herefordshire, the Grand Master Jacques de Molay had claimed Jesus to be the son of a certain woman, and since he said that he was the Son of God, he was crucified. According to John de Stoke, again it says Stoke, so we'll go with it, the Grand Master had instructed him on that basis to deny Jesus. The inquisitors asked him to whom or what he was supposed to believe. The Grand Master had enjoined him, John said, to believe in the great omnipotent God who created heaven and earth, and not in the crucifixion. This is not even Cathar, for the Cathar's God, the Creator, was evil. It could be construed as more or less Orthodox Judaism or Islam, and certainly during years of activity in the Holy Land, the Temple had absorbed a good deal of both Judaic and Islamic thought. The Inquisition was quick to exploit the confessions of Stephen de Stapelbruge, Thomas de Thornoldeby, and John de Stoke. Within a few months, most of the Templars in captivity in England had made essentially similar admissions. On 3 July 1311, most of them reconciled themselves to the Church, either by confessing to certain specific crimes and abjuring them, or by admitting to a general formula of guilt and agreeing to do penance. The proceedings at this point amounted, in fact, to a kind of plea bargaining, or even to an out-of-court settlement. In return for their cooperation, English Templars were treated lightly. There were no wholesale burnings such as there were in France. Instead, the penitents were consigned to monasteries to rehabilitate their souls. Reasonable funds were provided for their upkeep. It is worth noting, however, that of the confessions obtained in England, most were from elderly and infirm knights. England, after all, was neither a front line for military activity nor, as far as the order was concerned, a major political or commercial center such as France. It therefore provided a kind of rest home. Aging or ill veterans of the Holy Land would be, so to speak, pensioned off to preceptories in England as sinecures. At the time of their trial, a number of them were too feeble to move very far from where they had been incarcerated. They were so old and infirm that they were unable to stand. Reports one notary who recorded the proceedings. These were the men whom Edward's officers arrested when the king finally bowed to the pressure imposed upon him. By that time, as we have noted, younger and more active Templars would have had ample time to escape, and their number, as we shall see, would have been swollen by refugees from elsewhere. Escape from persecution. Medieval man did not share our passion for or precision in statistics. When chroniclers of the time speak of armies, for example, rough estimates are bandied about, more often than not exaggerated for propaganda purposes. Numerals denoted thousands or even tens of thousands, denoting thousands or tens of thousands, are invoked quite routinely and often quite implausibly, with an often exasperating disregard for accuracy and even credibility. In consequence, there is no reliable or definitive compilation of the Templars' numerical strength at any given point in their history, nor, for that matter, has any complete list survived, assuming one ever existed outside the Order's own archives, of Templar holdings in Britain or anywhere else. As we have already noted, official documents and rolls often omit a number of installations, preceptories, manors, estates, houses, farms, and other property, that are known from other sources to have been Templar. Thus, for example, the Order's major installations at Bristol and Berwick, both of which almost certainly included wharves and port facilities, do not appear on any official list. According to medieval accounts, the temple at the time of its suppression numbered many thousands of personnel across Europe. Some reports run as high as 20,000, although of these it is doubtful that more than a small percentage were full-fledged mounted knights. At the same time, it was established procedure in the Middle Ages for every knight to be attended by an entourage, an equerry or squire, and in battle at least 3 foot sergeants or men-at-arms. And French records indicate that this policy obtained in the temple as well. Much of the order's strength, therefore, would have consisted of fighting men who were not knights. But the temple, as might be expected of such an institution, also relied on an immense support staff: bureaucrats, administrators, clerks, a substantial number of chaplains, servants, villeins, artisans, craftsmen, masons, and it is rarely clear how many of these are included in such official records as survive. There are other areas, too, in which no documentation whatever exists, and in which even rough estimates are impossible. It is known, for example, that the Templars possessed a considerable fleet, merchant as well as naval vessels, which operated not only in the Mediterranean but in the Atlantic as well. Medieval accounts contain numerous passing references to Templar ports, Templar ships, Templar naval resources. There are even documents bearing signatures and seals of Templar naval officers, and yet no detailed information of any kind has survived of Templar maritime activity. There is no record whatever of the fleet's strength, or of what happened to it after the order was suppressed. Similarly, a late 12th century account in English speaks of a woman being received into the temple as a sister, and seems quite clearly to imply some form of feminine wing or adjunct to the order. But no elaboration or clarification of the matter has ever been found. Even more information, as might have been contained in official Inquisition records, has long since disappeared or been suppressed. It's all in the Vatican Library. That's me, not the book. An exhaustive consideration of both English and Inquisition documents, and a detailed study of the work of other historians leads us to conclude that in 1307 Templar strength in England numbered some 265 men. Of these, up to 29 would have been full-fledged knights, up to 77 sergeants, and 31 would have been chaplains. If the chaplains and other support staff are omitted, the number of fighting Templars comes to at least 32 and possibly as many as 106. Only 10 of these were definitely arrested and listed by the Inquisition, though another 3 Templars in captivity were also probably military men. This leaves something approaching 93 military Templars at large, men who escaped completely the clutches of the Inquisition and were never found. That figure does not include fighting men of the order who escaped persecution in Scotland and Ireland. The population of Europe in the Middle Ages was a fraction of what it is today, and although such numbers by modern standards would appear to be small, in the context of the time they would have been proportionately higher. It must be remembered, moreover, that the effectiveness of medieval armies, even more perhaps than in later times, was determined not by numerical superiority, but by training. At Omdurman in the Sudan in 1898, 23,000 British and Egyptian troops defeated more than 50,000 dervishes, inflicting some 15,000 casualties, while losing fewer than 500 themselves. In the action dramatized in the film Zulu, 139 British soldiers at Rorke's Drift in 1879 held at bay some 4,000 Zulus, inflicting 400 casualties while suffering 25. At the siege of Malta in 1565, fewer than 1,000 knights of St. John, together with their auxiliaries, repelled a Turkish force of 30,000 and inflicted 20,000 casualties. Statistics would be equally lopsided during the Middle Ages, with weight of horses, weight of armor, rigor of discipline, and sophistication of tactics proving as decisive as firepower was to the latter. In the Holy Land during the Crusades, a force of a dozen fully armored mounted knights charging on heavy horses would function like 20th century tanks, easily scattering a force of 200 or 300 Saracens. A massed charge of 100 or so mounted knights would crush 2,000 or 3,000 adversaries. In consequence, the prospect of perhaps as many as 93 trained Templars at large in Britain was not to be dismissed. With their professional discipline, their up-to-date weaponry, and their martial expertise, they could easily have proved decisive against the amateur soldiery and conscripted peasants involved in most European campaigns. Just such a campaign was then being conducted in Scotland. And that is the end of the chapter. That takes us on to Chapter 4, The Disappearance of the Templar Fleet, which we will pick up on Tuesday. This is Sunday, right? Yeah. We'll pick that up on Tuesday. And, yeah, we're blazing through here pretty quick. So it won't be too many more sessions before I have to start putting out a poll on what to read next. Because I think there are only 19 chapters, and we'll be on chapter 4 next time. So, a couple weeks, we'll be done with it. Alrighty, I'm going to end this session, and we take a quick break, and then I will be back for some Hogwarts Legacy. So I will see you all in a few minutes.
Prepare to die.